and welcome to another episode of Type 1 Thursday with me, Hanna. I am very excited to have you here, and today we have a very special topic. You may also realize this is not live for once. I'm trying something new, so bear with me. Today the topic is double diabetes. I was alerted to that this is sorely needed in the Type 1 community. And I was happy to do some research on it because it was super interesting actually. I'll tell you my personal story with it, or perhaps not with it, it was never confirmed, a little bit later. But first, what is double diabetes, you may ask yourself? Well, it is a type 1 diabetic with severe insulin resistance to the point of actually requiring medications that are generally used in type 2 diabetes. And this is not to be confused with type 1.5 or LADA or MODY or anything. This is really double diabetes. You have type 1 and then you get type 2 together. Yay! Double diabetes, double the fun. The problem is though that type 2 diabetes can't really be diagnosed in type 1 diabetes. You can't really do a glucose tolerance test. You can't really run an insulin test. So you just have to go by the diffuse symptoms, and this is the problem in that maybe people who should be diagnosed aren't diagnosed with this at all. And one contributing factor to this is that obesity rates are mirroring but also surpass the one for the general population. This is within the type 1 community. Type 1 diabetics are getting larger and gaining weight for some reason, which is not really clear yet. There are some ideas which I will discuss, but this is a worrying concept and will and has led to a lot more cases of double diabetes. So when you have double diabetes, so that is type 1 and type 2, yay, double the fun, the risks of macrovascular complications rise exponentially. So this is cardiovascular disease, it's coronary heart disease, it's stroke, it's the big ones. It's really the ones that can kill you quickly rather than the microvascular ones, which is nerves and vision and stuff like that, and kidneys. This is why it's so important to halt it in that way. What I find is the most disturbing thing with double diabetes is that it takes the suffering of type 1, which we all know and we all live with it 24/7, but it takes it a step further, and it really complicates all the efforts that you are trying to make for yourself to have a healthy lifestyle, healthy life, and try to live as long as possible. So this is another reason why it's so important to treat it and perhaps even get rid of it. So how does this come about? Because we know that type 1 and type 2 are inherently very different conditions. Type 1, as we know, is when the immune system, well, it's still thought to be an autoimmune disease, and that is when the immune system has wiped out the insulin-producing cells in the pancreas. Type 2 is when the body no longer recognizes the insulin that it is still producing, so that the energy can't be let into the cells, and many more things that is the role of insulin. It's a complex duality of diabetes. It's not so easy to get rid of, but I have some tips for you in the end. So what are the diagnoses? Well, actually it's quite fluffy actually. You can't, as I said before, you can't really diagnose it clinically, but what they are using are the are the usual ones that you use for type 2. So are you taking a lot, like massive amounts of basal insulin or total insulin? Do you have a higher BMI? Although BMI is really a very arbitrary number, but do you have a higher BMI? Is your waist circumference larger? Is your blood pressure high? Do you have high triglycerides? Do you have a hepatic fat? So that's a fatty liver, basically, where fat has accumulated in and on the liver. And is your A1C higher than it should be? The wrong diagnosis in these cases can be fatal, actually, because imagine if you present with all these symptoms that I just told you about, which normally point to type 2 diabetes, but you actually have developed type 1 diabetes. All these old age brackets of when you get type 1 and when you get type 2 are very blurry nowadays, so even if you are 40, 50, 60 even, it can't be ruled out anymore that it's not type 1. But what if someone diagnoses you with type 2 and you're in acute need of insulin actually? Then that can be very, very dangerous. And there is some link to why some people develop double diabetes is actually the misuse of new technologies. The loop things, the pumps that talk to the CGMs and handle things on their own, they're great, they're fantastic, but you also need to use it responsibly and not just think that whatever you can do goes. No medicine can cover for an unhealthy lifestyle. No matter if you're type 1, type 2, whatever, you can't find a medication that covers for it. The three possibilities or contributing factors is that you get insulin resistant by type 1 alone, which can happen. You become insulin resistant because of your lifestyle choices. Or you actually have genetic insulin resistance. And 1 or 2 or 3 of these somehow combined contribute to a double diabetes diagnosis. And the question that actually remains is that are some type 1 diabetics just that more prone to gain weight during intensive insulin therapy? We just don't know. There's not enough research out there on that. What we do know is that there are solutions, of course. I'm not a medical professional. I cannot tell you anything like that, but I can, from my experience and from my research, I can tell you what I found, at least, so that you have something to dig with and dig in to and perhaps talk to your doctor about if necessary. So the common sort of solution of double diabetes is eat a healthy diet and exercise. Yes, both of those things, although I really, really hate the word diet, but both of those things will and can improve insulin resistance. That's very true. However, there are a few things that we know from the type 2 world and that we know from the type 1 world, and that maybe they can coexist so that we can get a little better help for people with double diabetes. So what we do know from the type 2 world is that it can be put into remission. It can be put into remission with lifestyle changes. However, the type 1 diabetes will always persist. It will always be there. No matter if you get rid of the sort of double part of diabetes, the type 1 will always be there. This is where actually my favorite law of diabetes comes in, which is Dr. Bernstein's the law of small numbers. Because, and this actually explains it quite well, if you try to match a lot of carbs and a lot of sugar with a lot of insulin, how do you get insulin resistant in the first place? You push more insulin the whole time. And why do you have to push so much insulin? Because you're pushing so many carbs. And this is an equation that rarely goes together. This is why what he says and what I actually agree on based on both my own experience and other people's experience is that if you have little carbs or few carbs, you only have to match it with that much less insulin, which makes it easier for the body to recognize the insulin that you are using. And it makes that equation of covering carbs with insulin that much easier, and that can't, I don't feel like there's an argument there. So I really think that that is one of the key points in how to perhaps reverse the double diabetes. Because when it comes to insulin resistance, because of the reason I just explained, it really is one of the key things is to cut the carbs. If you don't eat that much sugar, you don't need this much insulin. It's quite simple. Another reason could of course be if you are on statins. They have been linked to increasing insulin resistance, so talk to your doctor about perhaps finding an alternative there. And or are you hypothyroid? Is your thyroid not perhaps as functional as it should be? That can also lead to weight gain, and weight gain is also commonly known as causing insulin resistance in the body. Why this topic is so important to me is because I very much suspect that I was a double diabetic myself before I changed my lifestyle in 2011, because I was on so much insulin for a relatively tiny person. I did show most of the symptoms of type 2 diabetes as well, but it was never diagnosed. I feel like since double diabetes has become a concept, which was in 1991, there hasn't happened a lot in that arena until very recently. So I wasn't diagnosed formally, but I'm very suspicious that I actually did have it. But now I want to hear from you. Have you heard of double diabetes? And do you have any experiences with it? Share it in a comment below and I'll be so happy to talk with you there. Until next time on Type 1 Thursday.